So, a reading from Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verses 9 to 18. At that time I said to you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. The Lord your God has increased your numbers, so that today you are as many as the stars in the sky. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, increase you 1,000 times and bless you as he has promised. But how can I bear your problems and your burdens and your disputes all by myself? Choose some wise, understanding and respected men from each of your tribes, and I will set them over you. You answered me, what you propose to do is good. So I took the leading men of your tribes, wise and respected men, and appointed them to have authority over you, as commanders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens, and as tribal officials. And I charged your judges at that time, hear the disputes between your brothers and judge fairly, whether the case is between brother Israelites, or between one of them and an alien. Do not show partiality in judging. Hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of any man, for judgment belongs to God. Bring any case too hard for you, and I will hear it. And at that time I told you everything you were to do. Over the last few months I've had a chats with clergy as part of their reviews, and a consistent theme has emerged. That many of them were doing some great good things during lockdown. But those good things have been wound down as life seems to resume. When I ask why, they say that they're too busy. One cleric who during early days of lockdown was recording a daily Bible study, and they were really good. Many people found them helpful. But they've now finished. And by the way, similar applies to me. This cleric has a building reordering, and now they've got to start sorting out grants and planning permissions. They're being asked to take on a new parish. Weddings are starting again, funerals, services, risk assessments. And they're all taking time. They feel overburdened. And what goes? Their word ministry, which, as we saw in our last session, is what they were appointed for. And by the way, if the person concerned is watching this, I know it applies to me as well. We meet Moses. He's on the eastern edge of the Jordan, on the edge of the promised land, and what he sees is God keeping his promises. God had created the world and it was good, Genesis chapter 1. Adam and Eve had rebelled against God, Genesis 2 and 3. The world had become a wasteland of murder, sexual immorality, conspiracy and deceit. God had nearly destroyed it in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. But in Genesis chapter 12, God takes the initiative in restoring his friendship with mankind. God promises three things. First of all, that Abraham will have many descendants, that they will be blessed, and that they will have their own land. And so today, as Moses surveys the scene, he sees, verses 10 and 11, that God is fulfilling his promises. And he prays that long may it continue. And that's our first lesson for today. A reminder, God is a God who keeps his promises. That despite our sin and disobedience, he is faithful. Remember that wonderful quote from 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 11. Here is a trustworthy saying, if we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Now Moses sees the truth of that, and perhaps something for each of us today is just to stop, to survey our own lives, and ask, how has God been faithful to me despite my sin and disobedience? Now Moses, in this first sermon, he's looking back over the last 40 years. He's recalling when they left Sinai for the journey to Canaan. He sees that, yes, God is fulfilling his promises. But this also raises a problem for him. Now remember, the job of historians is to pick out what's important amongst all the many facts and events. And what does Moses pick out? He picks out how he appointed leaders. Interesting, isn't it? Now there's several things I want us to particularly note. First of all, verse 6, which occurs just before our section today, verse 21, just after our section today. The job, the command, is to go and take possession. So this appointing of leaders is about fulfilling one of God's covenant promises. The point of leadership in God's people, of God's people, is to discern God's will, to listen to his voice and his commands, and we do that by reading the Bible. That's why we had just the other day, our last session, about making clear God's law. And it's to seek to guide his people in obedience to God's word. Verse 18, they have to obey before anyone else can. So leadership of God's people. Church leadership is about having the humility to recognise it's not my agenda we're pursuing, but God's will for his people and where he wants them to go. Now, second point to note. Moses recognises that God is fulfilling his promise, and that presents a problem. He hasn't got the time or the energy to do everything, particularly if he's going to focus on his calling to make clear God's word. He can't do it all on his own. So he recognises his limitations and asks for help. He gets the people to choose who they want as leaders, so their authority will be recognised. And these leaders are going to be for the family groups, for area groups, for the tribe. The task of making sure God's word is applied to every situation, be it family dispute or something bigger, is delegated. And that means God's word can be applied throughout the people, throughout every situation, consistently. And then, do you see the characteristics of those chosen? They have to be impartial. They have to be wise. They have to be spiritual. They have to act without fear or favour, without deviation from what God has told them to do. Do you remember Acts chapter 6, the apostles in the early church? They had the same problem, and what did they do? They appointed deacons to allow them to get on with their gospel ministry, the ministry that they'd been called to do. Point 3. If you go back and have a look at Exodus chapter 18, you'll see that this was a problem that Moses' father-in-law Jethro raises. Moses listens to the older man, to his father-in-law even, and follows his advice. And there's another aspect of leading God's people, about church leadership. Being willing to listen. And yes, being willing to listen to those older than us, more experienced than us. And there's a lesson for all of us as well, isn't there? But also perhaps for those younger in leadership, to sometimes to have the humility to listen to those older and more experienced and do it. But then for those more mature or more senior roles, something for you. Notice verse 17. When things get tough, verse 17, they are to take it to Moses. He doesn't shirk his responsibility, and he has the back of his junior leaders. A lesson for those in senior leadership. Cover your deputies and support them. So today, a reminder, God is faithful, keeps his promises. Take a moment just to reflect back on your own life, where despite your sin, your disobedience, God has been faithful to you. Some words about leaders, recognising that when we are overburdened and having the courage and humility to ask for help, maybe appoint assistants. And that implies that before we need those assistants, we'll be looking for them and training them, so that when the need arises, they are ready to help out. Then as leaders, remembering it's not our agendas or hobby horses we're pursuing, but God's. That those whom we appoint are God-fearing and will follow God's agenda and not their own. If we're younger, then being willing to listen to those who are older than us. If we are in senior leadership, making sure we have the backs of those who work with us and for us. And all of that raises another question for us, doesn't it? I wonder if they are the criteria used at the discernment panels as we in the church select people for ministry. I wonder.